Good morning, guys. Today is the final day of Fahrenheit 451. We're going to pick back up where we left off on page 143, so you can go ahead and get to that. And just to recap a little bit, we've got a new character here towards the end of the book. Montag comes across a group of men who are kind of hiding out around the railroad tracks, as Faber had mentioned before, that there are a group of people, kind of like fugitives, who've escaped, and they kind of make their way on the outskirts of the city. So they're hanging out in the wood line and they're warming themselves by a fire, and Montag stumbles upon them. And the guys know who he is. They know him by name, and he's kind of surprised by this, but it's because they're watching on TV that there's been this manhunt for a guy, Montag, and so they figured it was him. You get the impression that these men have probably done the same thing as Montag. They've had to escape just the same way that he has. So they welcome him in. And when they are introduced, you've got a variety of different men who are really a bunch of highly educated people, too. Former professors. Granger himself is an author. Professor West did a lot for ethics. Reverend Padover. So you have these very respectable men, respectable in our society, and Montag doesn't think he belongs, but they welcome him. I think that's an important thing to see here at the end, is that he finds a group of people here who are also probably fugitives, similar to his situation. Granger mentions that he's had actually hit a fireman before. So we see that perhaps he's found some people that he can have something in common with. So let's pick it right back up where we left off, where Granger asks, you want to join us? Do you want to join us? So he's being welcomed into a group of people. Very strange for this society. You want to join us, Montag? Yes. What have you to offer? Nothing. I thought I had part of the book of Ecclesiastes and maybe a little Revelation, but I haven't even that now. The book of Ecclesiastes would be fine. That's one of the books of the Bible. So we know that that's what he's spent time with. That's the book that he's read the most. And so he's referencing this like he has this with him. Obviously not physically. Well, the book of Ecclesiastes would be fine. Well, where was it? Here. Montag touched his head. Ah, Granger smiled and nodded. What's wrong? Isn't that all right? Said Montag. It's better than all right. It's perfect. Granger turned to the Reverend. Do we have a book of Ecclesiastes? One. A man named Harris in Youngstown. Montag? Granger took Montag's shoulder firmly. You walk carefully. Guard your health. If anything should happen to Harris, you are the book of Ecclesiastes. You see how important you've become in the last minute? But I've forgotten. No, nothing's ever lost. We have ways to shake down your clinkers for you. But I try to remember. Don't try. It'll come when we need it. All of us have photographic memories. But spend a lifetime learning how to block off the things that are really in there. Simmons here has worked on it for 20 years, and now we've got the method down to where we can recall anything that we've read once. Would you like someday, Montag, to read Plato's Republic? Of course. I am Plato's Republic. Like to read Marcus Aurelius? Mr. Simmons is Marcus. How do you do? Said Mr. Simmons. Hello, said Montag. I want you to meet Jonathan Swift, the author of that evil political book, Gulliver's Travels. And this other fellow is Charles Darwin. And this one is Schopenhauer. And this one is Einstein. And this one here at my elbow is Mr. Albert Schweitzer, a very kind philosopher indeed. Here we all are, Montag. Aristophanes and Mahatma Gandhi and Gautama Buddha and Confucius and Thomas Love Peacock and Thomas Jefferson and Mr. Lincoln, if you please. We're also Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Everyone laughed quietly. It can't be. It is, replied Granger, smiling. We're book burners, too. We read the books and burnt them, afraid they'd be found. Microfilming didn't pay off. We were always traveling. We didn't want to bury the film and come back later. Always the chance of discovery. Better to keep it in the old heads where no one can see it or suspect it. We're all bits and pieces of history and literature and international law. Byron, Tom Paine, Machiavelli, or Christ, it's here. And the hour's late, and the war's begun. We're out here, and the city is there, all wrapped up in its own coat of 1,000 colors. What do you think, Montag? I think I was blind trying to go things my way, planting books in firemen's houses and sending in alarms. You did what you had to do. Carried out on a national scale, it might have worked beautifully. But our way is simpler, and we think better. All we want to do is to keep the knowledge we think we'll need intact and safe. We're not out to incite or anger anyone yet. For if we are destroyed, the knowledge is dead, perhaps for good. We are model citizens in our own special way. We walk the old tracks. We lie in the hills at night, and the city people let us be. We're stopped and searched occasionally, but there's nothing on our persons to incriminate us. The organization is flexible, it's very loose and fragmentary. And some of us have had plastic surgery on our faces and fingerprints. Right now we have a horrible job. We're waiting for the war to begin and as quickly end. It's not pleasant, but then we're not in control. We're the odd minority crying in the wilderness. When the war's over, perhaps we can be of some use to the world. Okay, so the things that Granger's describing here is him and his friends are like these collection of knowledge, like literally a collection of books, right? Like they are, imagine just a stack of books in the woods. That's essentially what they are. They've memorized books so that they can have it, and if they need it, they can use it later on, if they want to reprint the knowledge or whatever. But in the meantime, they're just kind of like walking books. That's all they are. So it's an interesting group of people he stumbled upon. Do you really think they'll listen then? And if not, we'll just have to wait. We'll pass the books on to our children by word of mouth, and let our children wait, and in turn on the other people. A lot will be lost that way, of course, but you can't make people listen. They have to come around on their own time, wondering what happened and why the world blew up under them. It can't last. How many of you are there? Well, thousands on the roads. The abandoned rail tracks tonight. Bums on the outside, libraries inside. It wasn't planned at first. Each man had a book he wanted to remember and did. Then, over a period of 20 years or so, we met each other, traveling, got the loose network together, and set out a plan. The most important single thing we had to pound into ourselves is that we were not important. We mustn't be pendants. We're not to feel superior to anyone else in the world. We're nothing more than dust jackets for books, of no significance otherwise. Some of us live in small towns. Chapter 1 of Thoreau's Walden in Green River. Chapter 2 in Willow Farm, Maine. Why, there's one town in Maryland, only 27 people. No bomb will ever touch that town. Is the complete essays of a man named Bertrand Russell. You pick up that town almost and flip the pages. So many pages to a person. And when the war's over, someday, some year, the books can be written again. The people will be called in one by one to recite what they know, and we'll set it up in type until another dark age when we might have to do the whole damn thing over again. And that's the wonderful thing about man. He never gets so discouraged or disgusted that he gives up doing it all over again, because he knows very well it's important and it's worth the doing. What do we do tonight? Asked Montag. We wait, said Granger, and move downstream a little ways, just in case. He began throwing dust and dirt in the fire. The other men helped, and Montag helped, and there, in the wilderness, the men all moved their hands, putting out the fire together. They stood by the river in the starlight. Montag saw the luminous dial of his waterproof watch. 5 o'clock in the morning. Another year ticked by in a single hour. and dawn waiting beyond the far bank of the river. "Why do you trust me?" said Montag. A man moved in the darkness. "Well, the look of you's enough. You haven't seen yourself in a mirror lately. Beyond that, the city has never cared so much about us to bother with an elaborate chase like this to find us. A few crackpots with verses in their heads can't touch them. And they know it, and we know it. Everyone knows it. So long as the vast population doesn't wander about quoting the Magna Carta or the Constitution, it's all right. The firemen were enough to check that now and then. No, the cities don't bother us. And you look like hell." They moved along the bank of the river, going south, and Montag tried to see the men's faces. The old faces he remembered from the firelight, lined and tired. He was looking for brightness, a resolve, a triumph over tomorrow that hardly seemed to be there. Perhaps he had expected their faces to burn and glitter with the knowledge they carried, to glow as lanterns glow, with the light in them. But all the light had come from the campfire, and these men had seemed no different than any others who had run a long race, searched a long search, seen good things destroyed, and now, very late, were gathered to wait for the end of the party and the blowing out of the lamps. They weren't at all certain that the things they carried in their heads might make every future dawn glow with pure light. They were sure of nothing, save that the books were on file behind their quiet eyes. The books were waiting, with their pages uncut, for the customers who might come by in later years, some with clean and some with dirty fingers. Montag squinted from one face to another as they walked. "Hey, don't judge a book by its cover," someone said, and they all laughed quietly, moving downstream. So he's looking at these guys, and he's like, man, they don't look special, right? They don't look special. And that's something that Granger says. Granger's saying that they must remember they're not special, that they're not holier than the other people in society. They're just different. And once that part of society is gone, he's talking about waiting for the war to come and just wipe it away, something that Faber has also mentioned, that they'll be there to talk about books for the remaining people who want to talk about books. Maybe when you get rid of the majority, these ideas can start to come back. And he's looking at them, and they look just like average men, but obviously they have a pretty impressive secret, and there's something kind of special to what they're doing. So there was a shriek, and the jets from the city were gone overhead long before the men looked up. Montag stared back at the city, far down the river, only a faint glow now. "My wife's back there." "I'm sorry to hear that. The cities won't do well in the next few days," said Granger. "It's strange. I don't miss her. It's strange. I don't feel much of anything," said Montag. "Even if she dies, I realized a moment ago, I don't think I'll feel sad. It isn't right. Something must be wrong with me." "Listen," said Granger, taking his arm and walking with him, holding aside the bushes to let him pass. "When I was a boy, my grandfather died, and he was a sculptor. He was also a very kind man who had a lot of love to give the world, and he helped clean up the slum in our town. He made toys for us, and he did a million things in his lifetime. He was always busy with his hands. And when he died, I suddenly realized I wasn't crying for him at all, but for all the things he did. I cried because he would never do them again. He would never carve another piece of wood, or help us raise doves and pigeons in the backyard, or play the violin the way he did, tell us jokes the way he did. He was a part of us, and when he died, all the actions stopped dead, and there was no one to do them just the way he did. He was individual. He was an important man. I've never gotten over his death. Often, I think what wonderful carvings never came to birth because he died. How many jokes are missing from the world? How many homing pigeons untouched by his hands? He shaped the world. He did things to the world. The world was bankrupted of 10 million fine actions the night he passed on. Montag walked in silence. Millie. Millie. He whispered. Millie. What? My wife. My wife. Poor Millie. Poor Millie. I can't remember anything. I think of her hands, but I don't see them doing anything at all. They just hang there at her sides, or they lay there on her lap, or there's a cigarette in them, but that's all. Montag turned and glanced back. What did you give the city, Montag? Ashes. What did others give to each other? Nothingness. Granger stood looking back with Montag. Everyone must leave something behind when he dies, my grandfather said. A child, or a book, or a painting, or a house, or a wall built, or a pair of shoes made, or a garden planted, something your hand touched some way, so your soul has somewhere to go when you die. And when people look at that tree or that flower you planted, you're there. It doesn't matter what you do, he said. Long as you change something from the way it was before, you touched it into something that's like you after you take your hands away. The difference between the man who just cuts lawns and a real gardener is the touching, he said. The lawn cutter might as well not have been there at all, but the gardener will be there a lifetime. Granger moved his hand. My grandfather showed me some V2 rocket films once, 50 years ago. You ever seen an atom bomb mushroom from 200 miles up? It's a pinprick, it's nothing, with the wilderness all around it. My grandfather ran off the V2 rocket film a dozen times, and then he hoped that someday our cities would open up more, let the green and the land and the wilderness in more, to remind people that we're allotted a little space on Earth, and that we survive in that wilderness that can take back what it has given as easily as blowing its breath on us or sending the sea to tell us that we're not so big. When we forget how close the wilderness is in the night, my grandpa said, someday it'll come in and get us, for we will have forgotten how terrible and real it can be. You see? Granger turned to Montag. Grandfather's been dead for all these years, but if you lifted my skull, by God, in the convolutions of my brain, you'd find the big ridges of his thumbprint. He touched me. As I said earlier, he was a sculptor. I hate a Roman name status quo, he said to me. Stuff your eyes with wonder, he said. Live as if you dropped dead in 10 seconds. See the world. It's more fantastic than any dream made or paid for in factories. Ask no guarantees. Ask for no security. There never was such an animal. And if there were, it'd be related to the great sloth, which hangs upside down in a tree all day, every day, sleeping its life away. To hell with that, he said. Shake the tree and knock the great sloth down on his ass. So, one of my favorite parts of this book is when Granger talks about his grandfather. It's just a very memorable part of this story. The idea that we are what we leave in the world. And that's something that was missing in this society. He talks about Mildred. He can't think of anything that she really touched or did, her hands doing anything. She's of like no consequence to the world if she goes missing. But the way Granger describes his grandfather, who's long passed away, is that he's touched him. He's made an impact on him. The things he says, the things he's done, the way that Granger has chosen to live his life is all because of the person that his grandfather was. Makes his grandfather sound pretty awesome. But it also makes a really good point about people, about what we should value in life, about what we give to the world. Just a really important message that's dropped in Fahrenheit 451 here. So that was a nice little, sweet little piece about life and people. Look, cried Montag. And the war began and ended in that instant. Later, The men around Montag could not say if they had really seen anything. Perhaps the merest flourish of light and motion in the sky, and perhaps the bombs were there and the jets 10 miles, 5 miles, 1 mile up for the nearest instant, like grain thrown over the heavens by a great sowing hand, and the bombs drifting with dreadful swiftness, yet sudden slowness, down upon the morning city that they had left behind. The bombardment was to all intents and purposes finished once the jets had sighted their target, alerted their bombardier at 5,000 miles an hour. As quick as the whisper of a scythe, the war was finished. Once the bomb release was yanked, it was over. Now, a full 3 seconds, all of the time in history before the bomb struck, the enemy ships themselves were gone, half around the visible world, like bullets in which a savage islander might not believe because they were invisible. Yet the heart is suddenly shattered, the body feels and falls in separate motions, and the blood is astonished to be freed on the air. The brain squanders its few precious memories and, puzzled, dies. So, describing this swift war, that line, the war began and ended in that instant. Just bombs. The whole city is just bombed. And it's just obliterated. And the planes that dropped the bombs are gone. So this city is just destroyed. This was not to be believed. It was merely a gesture. Montag saw the flirt of a great metal fist over the far city, and he knew the scream of the jets that would follow would say after the deed, disintegrate, leave no stone on another, perish, die. Montag held the bombs in the sky for a single moment with his mind and his hands reaching helplessly up at them. Run, he cried to Faber, to Clarice. Run! To Mildred, get out there. But Clarice, he remembered, was dead. And Faber was out, there in the deep valleys of the country somewhere. The 5 a.m. bus was on its way from one desolation to another. Though the desolation had not yet arrived, was still in the air, it was certain as man could make it. Before the bus had run another 50 yards on the highway, its destination would be meaningless, and its point of departure changed from Metropolis to junkyard. So that doesn't sound like it's likely that Faber would survive this bombing either. Mildred, get out, run. He saw her in her hotel room somewhere now, in the half second remaining with the bombs a yard, a foot, an inch from her building. He saw her leaning toward the great shimmering walls of color and motion where the family talked and talked and talked to her, where the family prattled and chatted and said her name and smiled at her and said nothing of the bomb that was an inch, now a half inch, now a quarter inch from the top of the hotel, leaning into the wall as if all the hunger of looking would find the secret of her sleepless unease there. Mildred, leaning anxiously, nervously, as if to plunge, drop, fall into the swarming immensity of color, to drown in its bright happiness. The first bomb struck. Mildred! Perhaps, who would ever know, perhaps the great broadcasting stations with their beams of color and light and talk and chatter went first into oblivion. Montag, falling flat, going down, saw or felt or imagined he saw or felt the walls go dark in Millie's face. Heard her screaming because in the millionth part of time left, she saw her own face reflected there, in a mirror, instead of a crystal ball, and it was such a wildly empty face, all by itself in the room, touching nothing, starved and eating of itself, that at last she recognized it as her own and looked quickly up at the ceiling as it and the entire structure of the hotel blasted down upon her, carrying her with 1,000,000 pounds of brick, metal, plaster, and wood to meet other people in the hives below, all on their quick way down to the cellar where the explosion rid itself of them in its own unreasonable way. It's a pretty tough end for Mildred. It's probably true, though. I remember. Montag clung to the earth. I remember. Chicago. Chicago a long time ago, Millie and I. That's where we met. I remember now. Chicago. A long time ago. The concussion knocked the air across and down the river. It turned the men over like dominoes in a line. It blew the water in lifting sprays and blew the dust and made the trees above them mourn with a great wind passing away south. Montag crushed himself down, squeezing himself small, eyes tight. He blinked once, and in that instant saw the city instead of the bombs in the air. They had displaced each other. For another of those impossible instants, the city stood rebuilt, unrecognizable, taller than it had ever hoped or strived to be, taller than man must have built it, erected at last in grouts of shattered concrete and sparkles of torn metal into a mural hung like a reversed avalanche, a million colors, a million oddities, a door where a window should be, a top for a bottom, a side for a back. And then the city rolled over and fell down dead. The sound of its death came after. Montag lying there, gritted shut with dust, a fine wet cement of dust in his now shut mouth, gasping and crying, now thought again, I remember something else. What is it? Yes, part of Ecclesiastes. Part of it, Ecclesiastes and Revelation. Part of that book. Part of it, quick now, quick. Before it gets away, before the shock wears off, before the wind dies. Book of Ecclesiastes. Here, he said it over to himself silently, lying flat to the trembling earth. He said the words of it many times, and they were perfect, without trying, and there were no Denham's dentrifice anywhere. It was just the preacher by himself standing there in his mind, looking at him. There, said a voice. The men lay gasping like fish laid down in the grass. They held to the earth as children hold to familiar things. No matter how cold or dead, no matter what has happened or will happen, their fingers were clawed into the dirt, and they were all shouting to keep their eardrums from bursting, to keep their sanity from bursting, mouths open. Montag shouting with them a protest against the wind that ripped their faces and tore at their lips, making their noses bleed. Montag watched the great dust settle and the great silence move down upon the world. The lying there, and it seemed that he had saw every single grain of dust and every blade of grass, that he had heard every cry and shout and whisper going up in the world now. Silence fell down in the sifting dust, and all the leisure they might need to look around, to gather the reality of this day into their senses. Montag looked at the river. We'll go on the river. He looked at the old railroad tracks. Or we'll go that way. Or we'll walk on the highways now. We'll have time to put things into ourselves, and someday, after it sets in us a long time, it'll come out our hands and our mouths. And a lot of it will be wrong, but just enough of it will be right. We'll just start walking today and see the world, the way the world walks around and talks, and the way it really looks. I want to see everything now. And while none of it will be me when it goes in, after a while, it'll all gather together inside, and it'll be me. Look at the world out there. My God. My God, look at it out there. Outside me. Out there beyond my face, the only way to really touch it is to put it where it's finally me, where it's in the blood, where it pumps around 1,000 times, 10,000 a day. I get hold of it so I'll never run off. I'll hold the world tight someday. I've got one finger on it now. That's a beginning. The wind died. The other men lay a while on the dawn edge of sleep, not yet ready to rise up and begin the day's obligations, its fires and its foods and its 1,000 details of putting foot after foot and hand after hand. They lay blinking their dusty eyelids. You could hear them breathing fast, and then slower, and then slow. Montag sat up. He did not move any farther, however. The other men did likewise. The sun was touching the black horizon with a faint red tip. The air was cold and smelled of a coming rain. Silently, Granger arose. He felt of his arms and legs swearing incessantly under his breath, tears dripping from his face. He shuffled down to the river to look upstream. "It's flat," he said a long time later. "The city looks like a heap of baking powder. It's gone." And a long time after that, "I wonder how many knew it were coming. I wonder how many were surprised." And across the world, thought Montag, how many other cities dead? And here in our country, how many? 100? 1,000? Someone struck a match and touched it to a piece of dry paper taken from his pocket and shoved this under a bit of grass and leaves, and after a while added tiny twigs which were wet and sputtered but finally caught. And the fire grew larger in the early morning as the sun came up, and the men slowly turned from looking upriver and were drawn to the fire awkwardly with nothing to say, and the sun colored the back of their necks as they bent down. Granger unfolded an oilskin with some bacon in it. "We'll have a bite. Then we'll turn around and walk upstream. They'll be needing us up that way." Someone produced a small frying pan. The bacon went into it, and the frying pan was set on the fire. After a moment, the bacon began to flutter and dance in the pan, and a sputter of it filled the morning air with its aroma. The men watched this ritual silently. Granger looked into the fire. "Phoenix." "What?" "There was a silly damn bird called a phoenix back before Christ. Every few hundred years he built a pyre and burnt himself up. Must have been first cousin to man. But every time he burned himself up, he sprang out of the ashes. Got himself born all over again. It looks like we're doing the same thing over and over. But we've got one damn thing the phoenix never had. We know the damn silly thing we just did. We know all the damn silly things we've done for 1,000 years. And as long as we know that, we always have it around where we can see it, someday we'll stop making the goddamn funeral pyres and jumping in the middle of them. We pick up a few more people that remember every generation." So this is an interesting thing he talks about here. He talks about a phoenix, like this bird that rises from the ashes here. And he compares it, this metaphor is meant to compare to man. That this is what men do. They destroy themselves only to be reborn. And he's talking here about this really important part of why this book by Fahrenheit 451, what it's really talking about here, is that as long as these things are around so people can see it, now we'll know not to do it. But the moment you take away books, you take away history, you take away the things that people have done in the past, well, they're just going to keep making the same mistakes. So he brings up a really good point here. He took the pan off the fire and let the bacon cool, and they ate it, slowly, thoughtfully. "Now let's get on upstream," said Granger. "And hold on to one thought. You're not important. You're not anything. Someday the load we're carrying with us may help someone. But even when we had the books on hand a long time ago, we didn't use what we got out of them. Went right on insulting the dead. Went right on spitting in the graves of all the poor ones who died before us. We're going to meet a lot of lonely people in the next week, and the next month, and the next year. And when they ask us what we're doing, you can say, we're remembering. That's where we'll win out in the long run. And someday we'll remember so much that we'll build the biggest goddamn steam shovel in history and dig the biggest grave of all time and shove war in and cover it up. Come on now. We're going to go build a mirror factory first and put out nothing but mirrors for the next year. Take a long look at them." So in the last few pages, there's been a few references to mirrors here. They talk about how, Montag wants to know why Granger trusts him. And he's like, you should see yourself. You haven't looked in a mirror in a while. Just his look, his appearance shows that he's not a danger or a threat to them. There's also a mention here of Mildred looking into an empty blank parlor wall right before a bomb comes crushing down on the building. That thing of her seeing herself, instead of seeing the White Clown or any of the other ridiculous shows she's watching, her seeing herself is the most terrifying thing she could possibly see. The way she's described is really terrible. So that the blank parlor wall finally becomes a mirror for her. And Granger with this idea of building a mirror factory so we can all take a good long look at them. You know, that's saying, if you take a look in the mirror, why don't you go take a look in the mirror? Like if we really need to look into ourselves and see something in ourselves, kind of like Montag did with Clarice at the beginning of this book, you're going to discover perhaps some things that you didn't want to see. So, let's go build a mirror factory, shall we? I think it's a good lesson. They finished eating and put out the fire. The day was brightening all about them as if a pink lamp had been given more wick. In the trees, the birds that had flown away quickly now came back, and they settled down. Montag began walking, and after a moment found that the others had fallen in behind him, going north. He was surprised and moved aside to let Granger pass, but Granger looked at him and nodded him on. Montag went ahead. He looked at the river and the sky and the rusting track going back down to where the farms lay and where the barns stood full of hay, where a lot of people had walked by in the night on their way from the city. And later, in a month or 6 months, certainly not more than a year, he would walk along here again, alone, and keep right on going until he caught up with the people. But now, there was a long morning's walk until noon. And if the men were silent, it was because there was everything to think about and much to remember. Perhaps later in the morning, when the sun was up and they had warmed them, they would begin to talk or just say the things they remembered, to be sure that they were there, to be absolutely certain that things were safe in them. Montag felt the slow stir of words, the slow simmer. When it came his turn, what could he say? What could he offer on a day like this to make the trip a little easier? To everything there is a season. Yes. A time to break down and a time to build up. Yes. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. Yes, all that. But what else? What else? Something. And on either side of the river there was a tree of life, which bare 12 manners of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Yes, thought Montag, that's the one I'll save for noon. For noon, when we reach the city. And that's Fahrenheit 451. A great book with a great message. And perhaps we should take some of those things into account in our own society. And we should think about the things that we value and whether or not they are really the important things. Somebody like Clarice in this story talks about the importance of family and of talking and thinking. And that comes up a lot here. And you get this with the men as they're walking back to a city that's been destroyed by war. Imagine that there's nothing but death and chaos waiting for them. And they're going to go back and walk back into that kind of hell to help people, and not to throw books in their face. What good will that do? But they're going to be a group of people who are thoughtful and care about other people. And that's definitely what's more important than parlor walls or robots or cell phones or other technology, social media. So maybe we could learn from that too. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Fahrenheit 451 is a classic work. Ray Bradbury at his best. Waukegan's very own Ray Bradbury. One of my favorite authors. One of my favorite books. So, ever since I first read it. Hope you guys liked it. You guys have a good day.